Hi, welcome
welcome
back
back
to
to
Spirit
Spirit
and
and
Truth.
Truth. Today we are discussing 1 Samuel 18, 1 through 12. I've got NIV, so feel free to follow along. And it says, after David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him, and did not let him return home to his family, and Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with the tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was successful, and that gave him the highest rank in the army. This pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out of all the towers of Israel to meet King Saul with dancing and singing, with joyful songs, with tambourines and cymbals. As they danced, they sang. Saul had slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have greeted David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time, Saul kept a very close eye on David. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully onto Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the lyre, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had departed from Saul. Wow.
Yeah, this is so good.
This one is deep. Yeah. Let's just jump right in. So I think this really does talk about a lot of comparison. And I think that one of the biggest issues with King Saul was his need for recognition. I think he had a really big ego, and he couldn't help but to continuously keep his eye on David when the reality was he needed to keep his eye on God and what God had sent him to do, which again was at the end of the day to kill his thousands, not his tens of thousands.
Yeah, I think he was really rooted in like his identity of like I am king.
Yeah.
And when people started recognizing David as 10,000, like I think he was really scared because it didn't even say like when they're singing the song, all they're doing is recognizing what both Saul and David did, right? But he says like in my version it says straightforward like next they'll be making him king, and it's like they weren't even singing that, you know?
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, you appointed him, Saul. Like he appointed David in this role to protect the kingdom, and all David did was what Saul asked him to do.
Exactly.
So, yeah, like this was never about like him replacing you as king. This was just about doing what you asked him to do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, at the end of the day, too, we have to think that David also had kept his eye on God the entire time,
Yeah.
right? Throughout this entirety, David was like faithful. He was loyal. He would make sure that whatever task was assigned to him, he was going to complete. But he did it faithfully to King Saul. Like, I'm doing this for you. God appointed me to be here, and in turn, I'm going to be successful and faithful to you, which is really, really big.
Yeah, and I think with regards to like pointing back to God is at the end, right? Obviously, Saul throws a spear at him and tries to kill him twice, but like David didn't go in his flesh and was like angry. No, he was like he didn't hurt Saul, and we know we can recognize God was with David. So I'm sure if David did act in wrath, I mean, who knows the outcome, but I'm sure God would side with David in that, right?
Yeah, yeah. Or even like furthermore, it'd be like, well, then you're both departing from God. And like that
Yeah, that's
isn't his
it.
plan at the end of the day, you know? He wants to make sure that you are being loyal and faithful because it's true. I mean, at the end of the day, David could have retaliated and be like, you know what, if you're gonna try to kill me, I'll try to kill you too. But you're again, an eye for an eye is gonna make the world blind.
Yeah.
And that's not what God wants. So him being faithful to that was really big too.
And honestly, maybe it was a test. Like maybe that was David's test, right? Because he had this huge victory, and I feel like every time we get to like the next level, there's a big test. Like, okay, what are you gonna do about it? Because people, being people, get intimidated. People get caught in comparison,
Yeah.
and they're like, oh, like you're succeeding now, and all of a sudden people you should celebrate with you because you're on the same level are mad at you because you've grown. And it's like, no, I want you to get to the level I'm at, just
Mhm.
because I have it, you should understand that you can have it too if
Exactly.
God is with you, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, we even mentioned a good point too. Was I think we were talking about this yesterday, but
Yeah,
essentially the bigger picture is David was on your team, so
exactly.
it wasn't about me getting more than you or vice versa. It didn't matter because we still won. We're
Right.
still alive. We're still protecting the kingdom. Like everything is still well enough for us to be celebrating. For you to sit here and take one little thing and like focus so much into that and spread so much negativity off of that, could have been completely avoided if Saul would have, number one, could have communicated this to David, or number two, could have taken this to God.
Yeah, and to that, like, David's wins were Saul's wins because it was all for
Exactly.
what? The bigger picture is the kingdom, right? They protected the kingdom. Whether Saul killed 1,000 or David killed 10,000, no matter what you look at, it was all to protect their people.
Mm-hmm.
And like, he's upset that David's getting the glory, but let's say David didn't do the thing, then it would probably be the other way around, and the kingdom would have fell apart. The kingdom would have been the 10,000, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah. Another point I want to mention here is friendship.
yeah,
So if you look at 1, it says, after David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David and loved him as himself. And a really big point that we like want to mention here is keeping an eye on your friends, right?
yeah.
Because a lot of people want relationships but don't want friendship,
Mm,
or vice versa, and we have to make sure that when we do have friendships, especially as deep rooted as Jonathan was to David, that we want to nurture those friendships, that we want to make sure that we are the friend that we want to have,
yeah,
and as well as keeping an eye on, like, together they were with God, right? He, like, at a certain point, I mean, we definitely recommend that you read this through, but
yeah.
at a certain point, it was like Jonathan had to pick David or his
Dad.
father,
Yeah,
Saul. And it was like, man, like to get to that point where he just had to choose, is it going to be God or am I going to be without God? Because that really was the decision that he was making,
right.
was really, really deep. But he couldn't have got there without loving his friend as he loved himself.
Yeah. And I think too that you can even see like their bond when he gives his robe,
Yeah.
because I don't know if you know the significance, but like the robe is like, I say it's like people's signature, like people knew exactly whose robe belonged to who. So like
Mm-hmm.
him giving that to David, and then along with everything else, he gives him the sword, the robe, the belt. It's kind of like he was like, yeah, I actually trust you to protect me because God
Mm.
is with you.
Yep.
Yeah, like I trust the calling, like I surrender to God, even though he's giving it to David, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
No, that's really good symbolism. Yeah, I agree.
I think another thing, like going backwards in the act of comparison, is like when we compare things, it's so focused on the past and the present, and it's not focused on the future. One thing
Mm.
we talked about yesterday is like, yes, Saul killed only 1,000 at this point, and David killed 10,000. But like, who's to say if they continued on the right path that Saul wouldn't have killed more, right?
Yeah.
And it still goes back to like his heart wasn't postured right, right?
Mm-hmm.
Saul's heart was not in the right posture because he did it. He was doing it to protect his people, but I really think he was doing it for his glory to be like, look at what I did, and like be
Mm-hmm.
scared of me because I killed all these people.
Yeah. His spirit was off. Yeah. I think a really good point too that we did talk about was jealousy. And I
Yeah.
think that
Mm.
just to really like, deep dive into jealousy and like where it is rooted, um, anything that's so negative isn't from God.
Right.
And at a point when you have to realize, like 12, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had departed from Saul. But the Lord couldn't be with Saul if you're rooted in evil. You can't be with God when you are acting, when your actions are evil,
You're
right?
acting against God. You're not
Exactly.
allowing him in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And like God like cannot be in those spaces because he is of love. He is of goodness, right? So it's like you are purposely doing this, and like whether we like to like admit it or not, at the end of the day, it is hard to come and say, you know what, I was acting jealous, I was acting disobedient, like whatever the case is. But we have to get to the point of taking accountability for our own actions, right?
Yeah.
We can't act in jealousy and then tomorrow we're like, but I went to church, so I'm okay. It doesn't work like that. Like
Yeah.
through and through, we do have to be with God. And yes, it's hard. Like no one's saying it's easy. Like
Right.
Christians aren't out here preaching that, oh my God, this is like the best thing that's ever happened because it's easy. No, no, no. It's the best thing that's ever happened because we worked hard for it. And we know that at the end of the day, we've got God on our side. So I'd rather have it hard and difficult and have God on my side than have everything handed to me and be of the world. It's
Yeah.
just not an option. So I do have another point because I feel like this is really big in this whole section too. Is if we read 10, the next day an evil spirit came from God forcefully on Saul. And I feel like people can reach. And I feel like when we were talking, I know we keep saying yesterday, it's because we also run a Bible study.
Yeah.
We're talking to the girls about this, but essentially when we see things like this, and again because God is only good and God is only love,
Yeah.
we also kind of misconstrued how deep this is. And so when you're asking God to take you out of a place, right? I mean, at this point, King Saul is like, well, why didn't I have that? Whatever the case is, right? Like if we're acting from like jealousy or whatever the case is, um, we have to then come to an acknowledgement of what we can and cannot do. So in this case, when it says that the next day an evil spirit came from God, it was so that way God can show in a sense like he can help you with discernment and he can
Yeah.
help you with accountability. He can help you with your jealousy. Like for instance, you want God to take you out of a toxic relationship, it's going to take some work. And sometimes it's going to come like with a rude awakening, like God forbid, but he cheated on you.
Right.
That's a rude awakening, right? And like, yes, sometimes it is from the devil, but sometimes it is from God to tell you that's not the person for you.
Yeah.
Get up and go.
Because would you have stepped away?
Exactly.
A lot of times we get comfortable with where we're at, and sometimes it gets to a point where we're so comfortable that God does do things like this to like wake us up, like you said, and show like the true colors of what's going on, because God is omnipresent, right, in everyone's life, and he knows every conversation that's had that you're not in, and he knows like everyone's true intentions in their hearts, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
we see that Saul's always had a heart kind of against David since the moment that David started to get the glory.
Yeah.
But it also says, kind of in the beginning, like David was like Saul's son, right?
Mhm.
David might have saw Saul as like his dad, right? And he
Yeah.
might not have saw Saul as he was, Saul as he was, because David saw the love that he had for Saul.
Yeah.
So he couldn't see the other transaction of like, well, how does he see me?
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
he was rooted in love. So
Right.
he definitely couldn't have played both sides. But I think even furthermore, if we're talking about of the world,
Right.
I think a big part of this too is that when we're asking God to make our lives better, we are going to have to lose things in order to make it better.
Yeah.
I feel like this is
Mm.
perfect explanation of the next day an evil spirit came from God forcefully onto Saul. And God is saying, listen, you got to pick a side, okay? Do you want your life to go this way where you're continuing in jealousy, you're continuing in just negativity? Or are you going to back all that off, give it to me, lay it down on my feet, and then act right and act in goodness and act in love? And a lot of times, especially of the world, it makes it seem like it's a good idea at the time. Like, you know what?
Yeah.
This relationship might be good. This person might change for me, whatever the case is. But 9 times out of 10, if we want the good, we want the things that are from God, we are going to have to lose the things that are from the world.